Hello, fellow humans, and welcome back to Beyond Words. What if speaking two languages didn't just change how you communicate, but also how your brain processes the world? In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Jenn Krizman, a neuroscientist and lead researcher at the Brainvolts Lab at Northwestern University, to explore how bilingualism shapes the very architecture of our auditory system. We talk about the bilingual superpower, the way juggling two languages fine-tunes inhibitory control, sharpens attention, and strengthens the brain's consistency in processing sound. We discuss what it really means when research shows that bilinguals can better hear speech and noise, how these effects extend all the way down to the subcortical level, and why bilingualism can act as a kind of neural armor, even delaying the onset of Alzheimer's by several years. So for speech therapists, educators, and anyone fascinated by how experience sculpts the brain, this conversation reframes bilingualism not as a challenge, but as a profound advantage. So, what lies beyond the words we speak? Tune in and find out. Without further ado, Dr. Krizman, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I always ask the guests a little bit about their origin story. So I'm just wondering, what got you interested in this field, studying language development and...
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I've worked with Nina Kraus for a number of years, and one of the things that we do in our lab is music research, and we do a lot of music advocacy work, and I absolutely love it. But we also have a lot of research working with children from socioeconomic disadvantaged backgrounds. And so for me, a lot of these children were bilingual, and for a lot of people in disadvantaged backgrounds, music lessons are something that is outside of their financial situation. It's not something they can do. And so I wanted to look at, well, is it the case that just being bilingual gives us a lot of those same benefits that we're seeing for individuals who go through music training? So is there this hidden superpower that we don't really think about when it comes to these underprivileged kids? And so that's where I kind of set my work towards looking into.
That's awesome. And spoiler alert, there is a special
Yes.
superpower.
Yes.
Are you bilingual? Did that play a role?
So I don't think that I'm very good in my second language. I'm enough that I can get by, but I'm not great.
Got it. Got it. I'm super excited to talk about this because we've never talked about bilingualism or research relating to bilingualism specifically on this podcast. So, I just think it's super valuable to SLPs, especially since a lot of us are working with bilinguals. And so, yeah, I'm curious to know a little bit more about the bilingual brain. There's this quote that I don't know if it's in Nina's book or maybe it's something I read from you, but it's the bilingual brain is not the sum of two monolingual brains. I was wondering if you could maybe explain that.
Yeah. So the idea being that if you're a monolingual, you have the grammar and the vocab of a single language in your brain. And so, there's some thoughts that if you're a bilingual, that you have that same pool just gets filled with those words across two languages, or grammar across two languages, and that you're just a bilingual is just two monolinguals. But that's really not true. It's not like you can just completely turn off a part of your brain and say, I'm going to go into Spanish mode today, or I'm going to go into English mode for the next hour. It's that there's these two languages are constantly kind of interplaying with one another, and that there's this special kind of suppression that you need to do if you're bilingual to be able to kind of tamp down the language that you're not using in the moment, so that way you can really focus on talking and communicating in the language that you want. And so you're never ever operating in monolingual mode if you're a bilingual. So even if you're speaking for the entire day in a single language, you still have your second language going on in the back of your brain.
Yeah, so cool. There's this idea, and I don't know where I got this from. Maybe it was just something that I had just picked up from other people around me, but it was that, there was one part of your brain, like this specific part of your brain does English. This specific part of your brain does, a different language if you're a bilingual, for example, but you're sort of saying that this is not the case.
No. I mean, we use pretty much the same pathways regardless of the language that we're speaking, and it's just how those pathways have been shaped depends on the languages that we speak.
Very cool. You discuss, I heard a lecture that you did on bilingualism, and you discussed this really cool study about these like Chinese English word pairs that kind of
Yes,
illustrates this. Would
yes.
you mind talking about that a little bit? I thought it was so cool.
Oh, yeah. So I'll back up just one step and say um, so we have a colleague in our department, Dr. Viorica Marion, and she is one of the people who's done a lot of work in this area, looking at it, bilingual co-language activation is what the fancy term would be. And essentially what it is just the idea that um, even though you're acting in one language, your other language is still is never fully at rest. And so there's this test that we do called the visual world paradigm. And so what you see is you see these objects on the screen, and these objects will have some overlap. So you might see a marker, and you might see a match, and you might see, a bicycle, and then you might see a stamp. Okay, so then if what she found is that if you're looking at these images and it says look at the ma, as that ma unfolds to look at the marker, you'll also look to the match because there's that phonological overlap between the two of them. But here's what she found out that's really crazy is that if you're a Russian English bilingual doing this test in English and you hear look to the ma, you'll also look to the stamp because stamp means marka in Russian. And so you will actually have activation of that marka just by seeing an image of a stamp, even though you're operating 100% in English only mode. Okay, so that's kind of the behavioral evidence. And so then another group of researchers wanted to take this one step further. And so they were looking at just how your brain responds in these different language contexts. And so it was English monolinguals living in the UK, Chinese English bilinguals living in the UK, and Chinese monolinguals living in China. And they were doing a similar study like this, where they had to determine the semantic relatedness of word pairs. So like wife and husband are much more similar than say wife and asparagus. And so they recorded the brain activity called the N400. And so when you get a really large N400 when there's a mismatch. So you would get a small response to wife husband, but you get a large response to wife asparagus. And so they did this test in these three groups of participants, and they found that for all three participant groups, as you would expect, there was this large response at the semantically unrelated pairs. But what they did that's really, really cool is that they had this kind of surreptitious question that they were asking where they had pairs that shared overlap in the first character. And this was, of course, overt to the Chinese monolinguals because they were doing the task in Chinese, but then it was not overt to the Chinese English bilinguals because, like the English monolinguals, they're doing the task in English. But what they found is that they actually saw that their brain responses were larger when there was a character mismatch compared to when there was a character match between the two semantic pairs. So it
Yeah.
suggests that, you know, even though you are not acting in that mode at all, there was no reference to their ability to speak Chinese. There was never in the task was there anything that was done in anything other than English, but yet their brains still had this larger response when the characters mismatched between the two pairs.
Yeah, that just blows my mind. The
Yeah.
fact it also seems a bit tiring, right? Like that as a
Yeah.
bilingual, you can never sort of turn off that, completely turn off that aspect of processing, auditory processing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so then no matter what you're doing at every time of day, there's going to be this activation of the language that you're not currently using.
And I think this relates to one of one aspect, I suppose, of the superpowers that the bilingual brain is that you have this extra practice, so to speak, with inhibition and
Hmm.
inhibitory control.
Yes.
Is that the
Yes.
case? Or is that from
Yeah.
the practice and
Yeah.
like in the enhancements in executive function? Is that
Hmm.
sort of assumed to be from this like practice
Hmm.
of constantly having to
Hmm.
inhibit certain responses?
Yeah.
I'm
So
curious.
I mean, this is a big question because there's kind of two big camps that have emerged lately with the idea of bilingual advantages for inhibitory control.
Hmm.
So my work and others, what we've shown is that there is a difference in between bilinguals and monolinguals with inhibitory control. So the idea being that um, like we're talking about, if you're a bilingual, you always have those two languages active. You're constantly juggling two languages in one mind, and so you have to suppress the irrelevant language to be able to proceed to communicate in the relevant one. And so what we found is that if you measure bilinguals and monolinguals on tasks of inhibitory control, so just kind of domain general, so doing like a card sorting task along a shape dimension, sort one time, and the next time sort along a color dimension. That's a common way to assess inhibitory control. We find that bilinguals can do it faster and more efficiently than monolinguals. Um, but there have been some other studies that haven't been able to replicate these effects. Really, there's this camp that's saying there's really no advantages for inhibitory control for being bilingual. And I think, a lot of these studies are much more large scale studies than the smaller focus studies that we're doing. But I think it's a difference of, for example, like to me, it's akin to saying India and the United States are different countries. You can look at a globe to see that. So you can look at this big, wide lens view and say these are different countries. But that if you were to say, are Rockford and Chicago different places in the world, a globe wouldn't suffice. You wouldn't be able to step back at that big level and look. You'd have to really narrow in and look at a map of Illinois to say, oh,
I
okay,
see.
Rockford and Chicago are different places. And I feel like that's the same concept with this inhibitory control, is that, a lot of these very large scale studies that are looking at thousands of individuals and not finding an inhibitory control advantage, it's a very coarse, refined, it's a very, are you bilingual, yes or no? And we know
Yeah.
bilingualism is multidimensional.
Hmm.
Um, the idea of what kind of is the test used sensitive enough to pick up on these types of differences? What are
Hmm.
some other factors might affect it? But that when we do these really focused, controlled studies, we find that there are these advantages for being a bilingual with inhibitory control, and we
Got it.
find that they are meaningful, that these have everyday relevance, and so I think what we're seeing is that um, if you're a bilingual, being able to have that cognitive flexibility and that inhibition is going to be helpful for doing things like listening in noisy situations. Especially because if you think, listening in a noise, I think about listening in a noisy background as being very similar to trying to listen in your brain to determine what words you want to use and what words you want to pull up when you are trying to juggle these two languages. And so it has these very practical applications of, you know, inhibitory control is going to be important for locking on to that target talker that you're trying to listen to and ignoring all that distracting noise in the background.
Yeah.
And so, we see that it's really important for bilinguals to have great inhibitory control because they have to use that skill for listening for speech and noise.
Hmm.
And that it couples, I don't want to lead you know talk about this before you bring it up, but the idea that we also see these auditory processing advantages and that they seem to couple with a lot of these inhibitory control advantages.
Yeah.
uh,
No, that's so
mhm,
cool, and it makes a lot of sense too. I mean, given I've spoken a lot with Dr. Kraus, and
mhm,
her, given her framework of beams that are experienced with
mhm,
sound through
mhm,
these cognitive sensory motor and reward networks, affects our and we'll get to this in a second, our
mhm,
sort of subcortical, our afferent
mhm,
processing of sound,
mhm,
that increased practice in early childhood with like picking up on statistical patterns, not in just in one
mhm,
language but in two.
mhm,
Like
mhm,
it's almost like you're playing like advanced games, like
mhm.
at a higher level, which
Yeah,
it makes sense that you'd be
yeah,
better at that process, which is that's
mhm,
a lot of what's going on in hearing, speech, and noise, right? You're trying to
yeah,
pick out patterns, and if you're better at that,
mhm. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, think about it. Like, I think it's fair to say it. I don't think any would disagree that, if you're a bilingual, you have less time in a specific language, in a single language, because by virtue of having to divide your time up across two languages. And you're going to have, bilinguals tend to have a smaller vocabulary than monolinguals just by virtue of spending less time in that language. And so, there might not be as many of those language cues that a bilingual can rely on for being able to pick out target sentences or understand target sentences and noise, but they can use something like inhibitory control with it, which they've been honing and honing and honing through their bilingual experience to help them to lock onto that target sound.
Oh, it's so interesting. Yeah, I almost wonder too. It's like, and this could be totally off the rails, but as I've learned, we become an expert in a couple of different things. Like it started out, it was just music that I was good at, and then when you move to
Mhm.
domains, become a speech therapist, and then you do other
Mhm.
things throughout your life.
Mhm.
You sort of start to generalize these patterns of like these
Yeah.
meta cognitive patterns of
Yes.
learning
Yes.
across different things.
Yes.
So I wonder if something similar is happening, where like because you're learning two languages to this
Mhm.
high degree, that you're sort of picking up on these like metacognitive skills.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it goes without saying that bilinguals have been found over and over again to have better metalinguistic awareness. So just
Hmm.
understanding the rules of the language, what the components of language, what makes up language, and um, that they also then are so they have these metalinguistic abilities that are enhanced, and then they have these, like you're saying, metacognitive abilities that get enhanced too, because they're constantly having to deal with language at a level that's one step removed from a monolingual.
Yeah, cool. And maybe we could backtrack just a second. Is I think all this stuff is so important, and I wanted to address like historically, kind of where we've
Hmm.
come from and like where we are
Yes.
now, because I feel like
Yes.
it's been such an important shift, and a lot of the research that you're
Hmm.
doing has like been
Hmm.
bringing this to light. So it seems
Hmm.
like historically, is sort of our attitude about the bilingual brain. I don't know, maybe you brought this up. There's like this
Hmm.
paper like from
Hmm.
1923 or something about
Hmm.
like how monolinguals are just superior in everything. You should
Hmm.
never
Hmm.
like teach a different language.
Hmm.
And like since then, our understanding has just become more and more accurate, more nuanced, and kind of shown that
Hmm.
that's not a great story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, in the early part of the 1900s, there was uh being a bilingual was looked down upon because there was the idea, especially in the United States, I should really say in the United States, because there was the idea that if you were bilingual, that you were inferior in some way, that you were less intelligent, because all of the tests that were used at the time were based off of English. And so, of course, if you didn't know English, then you weren't able to do well on these exams. And so then, there was this very huge bias, and that was these flawed studies, this flawed data was then used to make policies about immigration into the United States and setting quotas for different countries, and determining who was going to be able to enter because they had a likelihood of assimilating or becoming part of the what was expected to be an American, which at the time was an English speaking monolingual.
Mm. Yeah, it's so crazy. So as your time as a researcher, like kind of
Mhm.
throughout that experience, have you seen ideas about bilingualism change as well, or when did this shift sort of start to happen?
I feel like it's gotten better. I feel like a lot of the work that we've done has helped with just bilingual education in America, that there's more schools who are now offering another language at a younger age. I mean, I I can remember back when I was little, it was almost unheard of that you would have exposure to any language other than English when you were in grade school. But there's now that I'm looking, for schools for my son, I'm seeing that there's the opportunity for him to take classes in Spanish, and have dual language immersion school programs. So I feel like it's gotten better, but I still think that the United States has a ways to go until they become uh, to the level that some other countries are when it comes to just the expectation that you speak more than one language.
Yeah, it is kind of crazy. Like my wife's from, she grew up in Malaysia,
Hmm.
and like she spoke like 4 languages growing up, like just
Yeah.
across different environments, and it was just normal,
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
for kids to do that. It's just so crazy to me. Um,
Mm-hmm. Oh
but yeah,
yeah.
so going back to some of the benefits we did mention, you mentioned like the kind of executive function benefits, maybe the
Mm-hmm.
metacognitive benefits, meta
Mm-hmm.
linguistic benefits.
Mm-hmm.
You also had this awesome paper looking at even like these basic
Mm-hmm.
auditory processing
Mm-hmm.
benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe some of those as well?
Sure. So in our lab, we have this brain measure called the frequency following response. And so what it is we have these 3 electrodes that we put on to the participant, one on the ear, one on the forehead, and one on the top of the head. And we just play a sound to their ears. And we record their brain response to that sound. So it might be something like da. So they hear da, 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 and we record that sound. And what we end up seeing is we get an FFR, this brain response, that looks a lot like the stimulus that evoked it. So just like a sound wave has a fundamental frequency, has harmonics, has timing, the FFR that we measure has all those different frequency and temporal components as well. And so we can look at how well the brain encodes specific aspects of the sound. And one of the things that we found is that compared to monolinguals, bilinguals have a much larger, more robust response to the fundamental frequency, which is really important for pitch.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Very cool. Yeah.
yeah, and so one of the things that we've seen with that in particular is that this all pretty much it all goes back to speech and noise. Is that pitch is really important for being able to tag your target talker that you want to listen to in a noisy background. So, because my pitch is going to be different than your pitch is going to be different than someone else's pitch. And so we can use that pitch, that steady rhythm of our voice over time to lock onto it and say, okay, this is the person I'm paying attention to. So for a bilingual, they now have these 2 cues that are really important for speech and noise that are enhanced relative to monolinguals that gives them this bit of a leg up for understanding speech and noise. And so this is going back to what I was talking about earlier, why, there are some disadvantages in terms of spending less time in a language and having a smaller vocabulary, because what we see is that being able to benefit from the understanding the context of the language, having that larger vocabulary is something that a monolingual uses to understand speech and noise, but that those cues aren't as available to a bilingual. And so another reason why I think there's this inhibitory control advantage for a bilingual, um, and this, you know, fundamental frequency advantage that we see is because they're using those cues to understand speech and noise. So they're compensating for their lack of time in that language by using all of these auditory and cognitive skills to do this listening task.
Got it. Got it. Like these compensatory sort of strategies
Exactly.
in a way,
Exactly. Which I
which
think is just another example of how a bilingual is not two monolinguals. Like they're using a completely different strategy to listen to speech in these everyday settings than what a monolingual would use.
and do you see these benefits outside of speech? Like so the processing the fundamental frequency. Do you imagine that that's the case for hearing birdsong or processing
Oh
environmental
yeah,
noise or like all of that stuff?
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we did a study looking at being able to detect different types of speech all the way through non-speech in noise. And so we did everything from tones through set words through sentences. And we found out that when there's sentences, the monolinguals do better. But then when there's tones, so then when there's no linguistic context and all you're using are your fundamental frequency and inhibitory control, bilinguals are now doing better.
That's so crazy.
Yeah.
It's like you're going into it's like you're two chefs trying to cook a meal and you have a different set of tools or like one has a pan, one has like an air fryer or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a
Yeah.
terrible example.
Yeah, no,
That's
I like it.
so interesting to think that, in this non-trivial way that bilinguals experience the world,
Mhm.
so differently. And,
Mhm.
everyone, I guess, has a specific, sound mind, sort of
Mhm.
fingerprint, but
Mhm.
that there are these really, deep even subcortical ways that your brain
Yeah.
is processing sound that is like, you're really hearing something totally different in the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So you also mentioned that the bilingual brain is more consistent
Yes.
in the
Yes.
responses. How does
Yes.
that relate to um, you know learning, or why is that an advantage that it's more
Oh,
consistent?
yeah. So I think one of the, I'll start by talking about what I think it stems from.
Okay.
And so, for a little more context for the frequency following response, we play this stimulus, this sound, a couple thousand times to the participants. So we're able to look. It's actually a very quick test. I know it sounds very long, but it's a very quick test. They hear da 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 da, and we look at their brain responses. And so we can look from each one trial to the next. What does the brain response look like to that da sound? And we see that it's very, very, very consistent for a bilingual, and it's a little bit more inconsistent for a monolingual. So same exact sound, and each time we look at that brain response, it's just there's just variation for a monolingual that you don't see for a bilingual.
Mhm.
And I think why that develops is because when you have phonemes across two languages, then you need to be able to compartmentalize and be able to identify the language that's appropriate at that time very quickly. So, if you look at a very fluent bilingual, their ability to switch between languages is often fairly quick.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so having that neural stability, that consistency gives them the flexibility to be able to uh, identify and categorize the words that are coming into the specific language context that's required in that instance. And so then it leads to these really nice brain changes. But what it has implications for is, similarly, it still is important for speech and noise. So if you're able to have that really fine encoding and consistent encoding of that speech sound, then there's going to be less things to disambiguate between when you are trying to identify what that speech sound is when it's presented in like a degraded, noisy condition. So when, for example, like if you're listening to a talker and you're in a noisy cafeteria and you're trying to make sense of what they say, there's this idea that happens when you hear these words unfold. So I see the chasing the cat. So you might not hear what that middle word is. You might hear just duh. I see the duh chasing the cat. And so these ideas of how speech perception and noise happens is that you have this cascade of activation. So all of the words that are similar to duh will be activated for you. And then you have to do this kind of conscious computing to find that target word. And so if you are able to uh, identify, or if you're able to encode these words with precision each time, then you're not going to have as much of a fuzzy representation. So you're not going to have as many words activating when you have this more ambiguous cue. So it really helps you to lock on to that specific target a lot faster than if you were to have a little bit more instability and inconsistency in your auditory processing.
Got it. That seems also like it's kind of tied up with the like executive function
Hmm.
inhibitory control stuff,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes, and we do find that they do relate with one another. So in our case, the children who do show the higher executive function advantages also show the more consistent brain responses.
Mm, got it. We got a question. So
Yes.
Ellen says she works with middle and high school students in English speaking schools, but a lot of the students are bilingual, and
Hmm.
their IEPs list specific learning disability as
Hmm.
first eligibility
Hmm.
and auditory processing disorders.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts? I mean, I noticed that there's a really,
Hmm.
really high rate of like misdiagnoses amongst
Yes.
bilingual
Yes.
population.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on, and this might be
Hmm.
like maybe
Hmm.
more of a SLP question, but
Hmm.
like, what are your thoughts on calling something an auditory processing disorder
Yeah.
versus just
I
bilingual?
yeah, I think that first, yeah, you're absolutely correct. I think a huge issue that we need to tackle is being able to quickly and with objectivity identify somebody who really has some type of disorder or disability, or is it just that they're a little bit delayed because they're bilingual and they will catch up? Um, Especially identifying what is, if somebody is behind, what is the appropriate treatment strategy that they're going to need to help them catch up? Because, and so one of the things that I do really want to do actually is, and I'm hoping to move in this direction, is to do a research study that looks at the frequency following response to see whether or not it can differentiate this a language delay from a language disorder in bilinguals. Because one of the things that we have seen is that in at least monolingual children, that there is a neural signature for reading disorder. There is a neural signature for ASD, and that signature is very, very different than what we see for a bilingual brain.
Mm.
And so if we can start to be able to just use a 30-minute assessment to be able to say this individual is a bilingual and they will catch up if, and this person has a disorder and they will need this type of treatment to catch up, then I think that it will help to alleviate some of just the burden and load that a lot of the SLPs face. My sister-in-law is an SLP, and this is something that she and I talk about quite frequently.
That's a great family collaboration there.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
that sounds awesome. Nina was also telling me like the FFR, like you should
Hmm.
use the FFR because it's hard to get. I mean, throughout my whole career as an SLP, it's like I don't think when I ask people about auditory processing disorder, I don't think most people they don't really know
Hmm.
exactly what it
Yeah,
is, and like they
yeah,
kind of use it
yeah.
as this like catch-all term for a lot of different
Yes,
things,
yes,
and
yes.
to be able to like more finely differentiate that, especially with an
Hmm.
objective tool like the FFR,
Hmm.
I think would be so helpful.
Hmm.
So Ellen, I think we got hold out for the but look
Yes.
into the FFR, and there was a
Yeah.
group that um, Nina recommended me to, but there is this kind of push towards
Hmm.
using the FFR and working with audiologists
Hmm.
specifically because a lot of them can actually run a
Yes.
test. So yeah, and using that as kind of a way, and it's like to call these bilinguals, you know, oh, that it's an auditory processing disorder when maybe
Hmm.
they have like I don't know, limited vocab or like they grew up
Yeah.
with the wrong
Hmm.
model or something like that.
Hmm.
It's so funny because if you perhaps if you looked at the FFR, you'd see actually they have enhanced auditory processing like across
Yes,
these
yes,
dimensions, right?
exactly.
So
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
And so, I think we just need a test that's going to have a great enough sensitivity to be able, and a specificity to be able to identify what the needs are of a child who's struggling in the classroom, because they might present with the same difficulties in the classroom setting, but the reasons behind it might be very, very different.
yeah. So maybe building on this,
Hmm.
I was wondering what other, because you did talk a little bit in the lecture about how mostly it's an advantage to grow up
Yeah.
with a lot of different
Hmm.
language experience. Are there ever times where you might warn against that? Like for example, like in autism,
Hmm.
if you have difficulty with theory of mind, for example, and your ability to
Hmm.
take perspective and like code switch and things like that,
Hmm.
would
Hmm.
could that be a complication where you're starting to pick up these patterns and
Hmm.
kind of jumble them together,
Hmm.
if that makes
Hmm.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it really depends on the situation. I think that for the most part, having access to intact language structure and exposure to just, you know, um, good examples of language are important. And so then, uh, you know, if the family might speak, let's say, Spanish at home, but you're living in an English neighborhood, it's probably better for the family to give them the child that exposure to Spanish, because that is the language that they know best and that they can teach best,
Mhm.
even though they might have an English experience outside of the home.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I mean,
Um,
for example, I mean, things have changed a lot, but back in the very early 80s, when my husband was born, he was born very, very premature, and his parents are immigrants, and they speak, Croatian and Italian as their first languages. And the doctors warned them the entire way. You have to speak English to him. You have to speak English. He's never going to even learn a first language. You can only speak English to him.
mm,
And so they gave him this impoverished language exposure because that was their third language, and they had wanted to raise him, bilingual or trilingual, but the doctors kind of scared them into a monolingual upbringing, and you know
yeah,
he either one would have been either it would have been
totally.
perfectly acceptable and perfectly wonderful for him to have been exposed to those languages from early on.
I think that advice is still pretty prevalent.
Yes.
Because I've seen, like, when I was working in the schools, for example, it was like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of kids
Mm-hmm.
who, especially Spanish English bilinguals, who the
Mm-hmm.
parents kind of felt that, oh, okay, we need to speak English in the home when English was
Mm-hmm.
their second language. And, you know, and they struggled with English, and I imagine because and I heard the parents talk and everything, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like you're just getting sort of, let's call it like unstable data, like
Mm-hmm.
an
Mm-hmm.
unstable data set, because like
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the sentence is formed this way and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's formed this way, and
Mm-hmm.
especially at home when you're hearing these like differences in language patterns, it's
Yeah.
like, no wonder you're kind of struggling with, okay, what is my
Mm-hmm.
sense, because it's
Mm-hmm.
not like
Mm-hmm.
we don't formulate grammar in the same way that we learn it. We don't like
Yes.
learn these
Yeah.
rules and then say that we're really
Yeah.
picking up on these statistical sort of
Mm-hmm.
probabilities in language. So
Yeah.
um, uh, yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I
Yeah.
see that still a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
is that something you'd recommend then to parents, like, speak your native language, and like,
Mm-hmm.
increase good language exposure, so to speak?
Exactly. Exactly. Give them exposure to uh, a rich and comprehensive language, because I mean, a lot has we understand a lot more nuances since the Hart and Risley study back in the early 90s. The idea of that the more language that a baby experiences, the better their language development. Um, but it's more about like the richness of the language and the complexity of the language. The more that you can expose a baby to a rich and varied and complex language, the better you are. So
Mm,
if you feel comfortable speaking in your native language and giving them that richness, then absolutely you should give them that richness through that language.
yeah. Do you have any thoughts on, so like, for example, in a lot of speech therapy, we emphasize motherese, and
Hmm.
when you start to teach certain, teach carrier phrases like, want this, so you're kind
Hmm.
of speaking in like, uh, like, kind of in the zone of proximal development. You're sort of like
Hmm.
starting with these very simple things,
Hmm.
but they're maybe not, grammatically accurate, like they lack a
Hmm.
subject or something like that.
Uh-huh.
What do
Hmm.
you think about that kind of model of teaching language?
I still love it. I still think I think Motherese absolutely has its value. I think that uh, I think a lot of the work nowadays is really pointing to the idea that there's that infant directed speech, but then they're also kind of exposed to and sometimes participate in that richer speech of just the, adults talking with one another and that type
Hmm.
of language exposure. And sometimes, you might narrate your day to your child in a way that doesn't have that same level of mother ease, but when you really want them to look at the ball, see the ball, it's
Yeah.
red,
Yeah.
that's very different than I'm going to change your diaper now. Oh, your diaper's dirty.
Yeah.
So they're getting this directed speech, but then they're also hearing, the speech around them as well.
That's great. I love that. That, definitely falls in line with what we're doing as well. I mean, especially since it's so, I think the musicality of early infant directed speech is so critical to
Yes.
like catching,
Yes.
making it more engaging. And oh, so we
Hmm.
got a question from
Yeah.
Carolina.
Hmm.
As a bilingual SLP working with families in California, um, she's still shocked to hear families being told to stop exposing their children to second and third languages. Um, yeah, so yeah, definitely. I
Hmm.
guess more of a comment for sure. You
Yeah,
want to give as much good language exposure as possible. Um,
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. And, even if a child is only able to master the home language, that's still a language mastered, and that's absolutely wonderful. Than having them really try to struggle in, a different language than what's spoken at home, because that's what you're forcing the parents or caregivers to use with the child.
yeah. So kind of speaking about kids learning second languages, do you have any are, is there much solid evidence about like the sensitive period now for like second language acquisition?
Hmm.
Have we,
Hmm.
as a field, have we decided that like these are the
Yeah.
ages, or
Yeah, I think that certainly it's certainly a lot of evidence is showing that learning before the age of 7 is going to give you the best chance of, like, let's say, not having an accent or being the most native like for a second language. But people can learn languages at any age nowadays. It's just that uh, uh, you know we're starting to change the way that we teach language to adults than from what we had been before. We previously had been very classroom learning structure, the structure of the language, the grammar, the verb tenses, and all of that. And I think we're moving into going back to a bit more how we learn as children, our languages. And apps like Duolingo are really trying to do something like that now. Um, but it's getting to the point where if you are motivated to do it, if you practice all the time, and if you're willing to make mistakes with others, then I think you can learn a second language.
cool? Yeah, that's encouraging. Do you know of any research on, are there differences depending on what type of bilingual you are? For example, like if you're Spanish English, where
Yeah.
the differences are quite close versus like like Chinese and English or Japanese and
Hmm.
English, where
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
maybe the sentence order is flipped, or
Hmm.
is there a difference in coactivation? Is there
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
more or less inhibitory control or things like
Yeah,
that?
it's hard to say exactly, because a lot of the bilingual research that has been done has had English as one of the languages.
Hmm.
So a lot of the research is English but there's starting to be some more work with Spanish Catalan, and um, looking at just different language pairs. And a lot of people have found that those inhibitory control advantages, especially in early childhood, seem to persist across language pairs.
Hmm.
And a colleague of ours out at University of Connecticut, Erica Skoy, she has replicated the fundamental frequency encoding enhancement in different language backgrounds, different
Cool.
language pairs. So this was something that we had originally found in Spanish English bilinguals, but she's found it in just kind of a melting pot of language pairs.
Awesome. Do the benefits of bilingualism, come into play in the same way as they do music? Like, for example, even if I'm starting to learn like Italian or something, like
Mhm.
when I'm in my 30s
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
40s, is there are there benefits? Like, so in one of Nina's studies, she showed that like
Mhm.
they had, I think there were high schoolers that took music lessons, and
Yep.
actually you were part of the study too.
Yeah.
You're the one who like kind of made it go on.
Yes.
But after one year, you didn't see these
Mhm.
really
Mhm.
extreme changes in
Mhm.
especially in subcortical auditory processing. But after 2
Yeah.
years, you did see these
Yeah.
changes. So
Yep.
do you think that there's something similar in learning a second language?
I think there is, but I am in the process of collecting those data now.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm looking at individuals, middle-aged adults who've learned their second language as adolescents and young adults, to see whether or not we see those same enhancements in them as we do in our younger bilinguals.
Cool.
So
Let
I
me
will
know
let
if you
you
need,
know.
yeah, let me know if you need more participants.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, for
I've
sure.
spent basically learned Japanese when I was older. So,
Amazing.
uh,
Yeah.
and live there, and
Hmm.
can now speak it conversationally. But
Amazing.
I don't know what the differences might be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Very cool. So you talked about a little bit about collecting this data. Is there anything else that you're excited about or researching right now that
Um,
you want the field to know about?
I mean, that's my big project right now is really moving into middle age. As I became middle aged, I became more interested in what happens to the middle aged brain.
Yeah,
So I really want to see if we can extend a lot of these findings into middle age, especially because there's really not a lot of studies on middle aged adults, and yet
yeah,
we represent the majority of the workforce, and you know we know that it's every day in at work you probably encounter somebody who is bilingual or a non-native English speaker, and so I think it's an important age group to study.
yeah, yeah. I definitely feel not enough focus on us. Come on,
Yes,
because
exactly.
so one thing Nina mentioned in her book is that there are different ways to show enhanced auditory processing, like
Hmm.
bilingualism being one, music being one,
Hmm.
and
Yes,
also athletics. So,
yes,
which is a
yeah,
different mechanism, but I know
yes,
that you've researched this a little bit as well.
yes.
Can you maybe just speak about this? I know it's a little bit off the bilingual topic, but
Yeah, sure, sure. So, um, when we look at the frequency following response in athletes, and so these are college level athletes who've been playing their sport for a couple of decades now. And if we compare their FFRs to individuals who are non-athletes, just regular Northwestern students, we find that their brain responses are quieter than non-athletes, which is a totally different enhancement than what we see with musicians, where musicians really enhance those harmonics of speech, the things that help you tell apart uh, dad from a bad, versus a bilingual who has that enhanced pitch who helps you follow a target, talker, and noise. And we see that there's these quieter brains. And, why is that? Well, if you think about a lot of the sports that we're working with, so basketball, football, baseball, um, there's a very large auditory component where you have to respond very quickly to an auditory cue. So, for example, in football, you're really listening to the quarterback's voice for when he's going to put the ball into play, or for basketball, you're trying to listen for your teammate who you might be passing the ball to, or catching, receive the ball from. And so we think that because there's these auditory signals that might happen at any point in competition for an athlete, that you can't necessarily enhance your response because you don't know when to enhance it. So instead you respond by tamping down that noise so you're more ready for that response when it comes to you.
very cool. Thank you so much for doing this research. I mean, it really is contributing to like so deeply and richly to like our knowledge of our auditory life
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
what recommendations to give.
Yeah.
And it's cool too that we have these sort of like I don't know like orthogonal ways of
Yeah.
enhancing a child's language
Yeah.
development, especially if if they might show
Yes.
difficulties in reading or something like that.
Hmm.
You have all these different approaches, so you can
Yes.
recommend, for example, maybe the kid is hates music and
Hmm.
I've had some kids that
Hmm.
are just not that's not their thing, so like you can also show that athletics and sports can enhance
Yeah.
aspects of sound processing, so that's
Absolutely,
cool.
absolutely. And speaking of, just one of the studies that I did was looking at children from higher and lower socioeconomic standing, and looking at whether or not this bilingualism could offset some of the effects of socioeconomic impoverishment for auditory health and development. And so we had low SES bilinguals and monolinguals, and we had high SES bilinguals and monolinguals. And what we found is that those low SES bilinguals had more consistent responses, just like the high SES monolinguals and bilinguals, whereas our low SES monolinguals had much more inconsistent brain responses.
Mm.
So they really had and what's interesting is that this is something that we see in children with reading disabilities, is that you have a much more inconsistent response to sound.
Mm.
And we know that it's much more challenging than for things like phonemic encoding or phonemic awareness, because if you're not able to have this reliable representation of a sound each time you hear it, how can you actually identify what that sound is? And so we've linked this instability in the brain response to reading pre-skills, so pre-skills, sub-skills for reading, and we find that this measure and this phonemic encoding ability is actually improved in low SES children who are bilingual compared to low SES children who are monolingual.
Yeah.
So when
Wow.
I think about like why this can be a superpower, to me, this is a really good example of, you know, if you have that ability, if you have that gift that you can give of teaching another language to your child, absolutely, please do it.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's one of my big soapbox things in doing this podcast. It fits right exactly in there. Is that neurobiologically we are what we do,
Hmm.
and you can imagine like it's almost like a really rich form of exercise that you're doing every
Yeah.
day when you're
Yes.
like engaging in these two different languages and having to switch between them, because learning a language is it's so incredibly complicated. No one has cracked the
Yes.
code and like what exactly is going on, right? And it's like
Yeah.
one of the most amazing things that we as humans accomplish and become experts in. And so to do this twice, in two different ways is like this
Yeah.
incredible exercise. So it's like you can
Yes.
imagine being in a family where it's part of your routine to every day you I don't know, you go out and exercise after school or whatever, whereas the other
Yeah.
one, maybe you go and sit watch TV and eat potato chips or something. You probably see after a while like what
Hmm.
the manifestations of those differences are across
Yeah.
time, and
Yeah.
this is maybe something similar to that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you see it too in the long term for bilinguals. One of the things that I forgot to mention earlier when when you're asking about whether or not this has benefits long term is that there's been a number of studies that have found that if you are a bilingual, you will show symptoms of Alzheimer's 4 to 5 years later than a monolingual.
That's
So
so
it
crazy.
takes more neural degeneration and degradation to become symptomatic for a bilingual than for a monolingual. So
Wow.
it's this neural armor that you've armed yourself with by having all of that time practicing cognitive flexibility and inhibitory control and attention and um, all of these different measures that you've been practicing over your lifetime, speaking and knowing two different languages.
You said four to
Uh,
five years?
yeah, 4 to 5.
Wow.
Like, yeah, yeah.
If
So
you could sell a
almost half a
pill like
decade.
that,
Yeah.
yeah, that's incredible. Yeah,
Hmm.
such incredible benefits.
Yeah.
Very
So,
cool.
and so you think about just the wonderful, you know, just how wonderful that is. And so you want to just tell everybody, you want to shout from the rooftops, go learn a second language. It's great.
Amazing.
So,
Yeah, and definitely all the SLPs out there, make sure that you're explaining to your parents how special it is to give them
mhm,
this gift that is like,
mhm.
potentially a life enhancing, um,
Yeah,
elongating, gift. Very
yeah.
cool. So I guess wrapping up, we have just a few more minutes left.
Mhm,
What do you think is like not well understood or something that's understudied in this field
mhm.
that you'd like to see more researched
Yeah.
on?
Yeah, going back to what we were talking about earlier is just being able to disambiguate quickly and objectively a delay versus a disorder. Um, Being able to identify what type of help a child needs to be able to excel in a school setting, I think is incredibly important and incredibly understudied, especially being able to get this going in children at a young age before they might start to show any signs that they're going to have any of these struggles. So I think really identifying early intervention that is useful for children from any language background, whether it's a bilingual, a native English speaker, um, somebody who speaks a language other than English. I think it's really, really important.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Krizman. You're an inspiration. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate your expertise.
Thank
Um,
you.
where if you want people to get involved, where can people find you?
Oh, please, please, please visit our website, brainvolts.northwestern.edu. On the home page, you're going to find a whole bunch of icons that are kind of hexagonal shaped. There's one called Bilingualism. If you click on that, it will take you to all of our publications. There's also another link for clinicians. And if you click on that, it has all of our articles for that are targeted for a clinical audience. And there are some articles on bilingualism in there as well. And if you want to get a hold of me, it's j-krizman, Krizman, at northwestern.edu. But yeah, and please feel free to email with any questions, but definitely, definitely check out our website.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any questions in the chat before we kind of wrap up? Okay, we'll just wait and do a little house cleaning. But thank you so much again. Any last remarks or conclusions that you want to leave us with? Any
Uh,
thoughts?
it, yeah, I know it can be more challenging now, but it's never too late to start learning a second language. And if your littles are interested, absolutely encourage them to start learning a second language. And I think to encourage parents that they're doing the right thing by speaking to their child in their native language.
Awesome. You mentioned sort of knowing a second language. What other
Yeah,
language do you speak?
Croatian.
Croatian. Cool.
Yeah,
Can you
yeah.
can you maybe give us one one phrase in Croatian or like goodbye? How do you say goodbye in Croatian?
Oh my gosh, now you're putting me on the spot. Now I'm getting all
Sorry,
nervous.
sorry, sorry. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but um, yeah, I'm just trying to work out the second language brain. But yeah, there are so many great like tools now. I noticed that even with like ChatGPT and stuff, you can
hmm
use it as a conversation partner. So
hmm
and it used to have a terrible accent. Like when I spoke to it in
Yes.
Japanese, it used to have a really bad accent, and somehow it switched, and now it sounds great. So
Yeah.
it's
I haven't tried out the Google Translate in a while for Croatian, but it used to be a very mechanical computer sounding voice.
yeah, yeah,
So, so
not a rich like good language exposure type of thing. Yeah,
no, no. So well, we'll see. I think, it's certainly gotten better. Um, but we'll see how it goes. I mean, it's allowed to make mistakes. We're allowed to make mistakes.
definitely.
So,
Yeah, and
and
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, I was going to say, I think, we just have to become comfortable with making mistakes in a second language, and that we're going to say silly things sometimes, and that's how you get better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's another thing that I'm encouraging therapists to, be comfortable being kind of vulnerable in front of your kids and making mistakes.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think that opens a lot of doors. Um,
Yes. Absolutely. I think that it's important that we are good models of language for children. I
yeah,
think that we need to just, yeah, we need to be a good model, and we need to just encourage children to practice their language, to make their mistakes, and to do all those cute things that kids do when they're learning language.
yeah, yeah. I was just listening to this podcast on language, and they're making this interesting point about how it's not like there's nothing genetic. We have no genetic information about language. When you're born, if you grew up on a desert island, you wouldn't develop language.
hmm
But language it exists in kind of
hmm
culture and in
hmm
society,
hmm
and it's kind of up to the models, or
hmm
it's up to the parents and the people
hmm
in that society to teach kids
Hmm.
language. And it's important. I think a lot of parents tend to think that uh, language just kind of emerges, it's like teeth or hair, it should just grow and
Yeah.
like they should
Yeah.
have it.
Yeah.
But it's really
Yeah.
important that we are good models of language, because they're picking up,
Yes.
kids are picking
Yeah.
up on those patterns
Yeah.
and learning them. So
Yes.
yeah.
Well, I mean, although it's interesting, there is like Jeannie, the girl who was kept
Right.
in, yeah, and the idea that I think she challenged a lot of the idea of there being a critical period for language development, because she did begin to learn language once she was outside of that terrible, terrible environment.
Right.
Um, but it also
Right.
kind of suggests that there might be something very, very fundamental about language that exists beyond culture, that even in the absence of having, a cultural reason for language, that we have this innate ability to create language. Um,
Definitely. Yeah, I
yeah.
think I was thinking more about the specific like forms,
Yeah.
specific
Yes.
ways that we, formulate language,
Yes.
and semantics and syntax and things
Yeah.
like that. Um,
Yes.
but yeah, definitely,
Yes.
there is a pretty strong drive to connect, sort of like language is
Hmm.
the way that we sort of see into other people's brains in a way. So
Yes. Oh, yes. Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you so much. It was awesome to meet
Thank
you
you.
and to speak with you, and thank you for
Thank you.
again for sharing your expertise.
Hmm.
For everyone
Absolutely.
in the call,
Absolutely.
and this is the last Converging Careers episode, but I will be back with some more episodes for a new podcast series that's coming out. So look forward to hopefully seeing you all then. Yeah.
All right. And I won't leave you hanging. So do widzenia.
Do widzenia. Okay, that's
Yes.
awesome. All right, do widzenia, everybody.
Yeah.
We'll see you. Take care. All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you very
everyone.
much. Bye.